The house stands in the dark with its windows open to the warm Iowa night, the kind of night that carries the smell of cut grass and distant farmland, a night that feels safe because it always has been. Villisca sleeps without fear, as it usually does in 1912, a town where routine governs life and nothing truly unexpected ever seems to happen. Earlier that evening, the Moore family returned home after a church program, their movements unremarkable, their voices calm, their lives following a pattern worn smooth by repetition. Josiah Moore locked his hardware store and walked back to 2nd Street with his wife Sarah and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, while 2 young guests, sisters Lena and Ina Stillinger, followed them inside for the night. Beds were prepared, lamps were dimmed, and the house settled into silence. Sometime after midnight, a presence entered that silence without resistance. There was no forced door, no raised voice, no sound that reached the street. Inside, the killer moved deliberately, taking an axe that belonged to the family, and using it with a calm that suggested time was not a concern. Each room was visited in turn, each victim attacked while sleeping, and after each death the curtains were drawn, the mirrors covered, the rooms darkened as if light itself was unwelcome. The killer stayed long enough to rearrange objects, to leave behind details that would never fully make sense, and when it was over, the house returned to stillness. Morning arrived gently, unaware of what it revealed. Neighbors noticed the absence before they understood it, and when the door was opened, the silence inside felt heavier than expected. What followed was confusion. Too many people, too many hands, a crime scene disturbed before it could be understood. Newspapers arrived quickly, turning the quiet town into a national fixation, while investigators struggled to rebuild a story from fragments already damaged. Suspects came and went. A traveling preacher who confessed and recanted, a disgruntled former employee, figures who seemed suspicious only because fear demanded someone to blame. None could be proven responsible. Years passed and the case remained open but unresolved, its certainty dissolving into speculation. The house stood empty, then occupied, then empty again, acquiring a reputation that lingered longer than any family ever did. Even as Villisca changed, the Moore house remained, unchanged in posture, holding within it a silence that never fully explained itself. No confession ever came, no final truth emerged, and the murders stayed suspended in uncertainty. On 2nd Street, the nights can still feel ordinary, but the quiet there carries weight, as if something paused long ago and never resumed. The investigation began already wounded, shaped more by urgency than care, as deputies and townspeople moved freely through the rooms, touching walls, lifting objects, trying to understand what could not yet be understood. The axe was found inside the house, its blade wiped clean, its handle resting where it did not belong, and even that detail was handled too often, passed from hand to hand, stripped of whatever truth it might have carried. Bloodstains were washed away before they could be studied. Footprints blurred into nothing, and the order of events became uncertain almost immediately. What remained was a series of impressions rather than facts. The careful way the killer covered mirrors, the methodical closing of curtains, the absence of haste. These were not the actions of someone fleeing, but of someone lingering. As news spread beyond Iowa, Villisca became a name spoken with disbelief, then fascination. Reporters filled the streets, sketching the house, describing the town, turning private grief into public spectacle. The Moore family, once known for their ordinary decency, became symbols, frozen in the final moments of their lives, while their neighbors learned what it meant to be watched by the nation. Inside the investigation, suspicion shifted constantly, attaching itself to men whose only certainty was their proximity to fear. The traveling preacher, Reverend George Kelly, drew attention for his erratic behavior and disturbing confessions, but his stories changed each time they were examined, collapsing under their own weight. Others were accused quietly, then loudly, then forgotten. Each failure deepened the sense that whatever truth existed had already slipped away, lost in the first hours when the house should have been silent and sealed, but instead became crowded and exposed. As months turned into years, the murders settled into the town like a bruise that never fully faded, darkening whenever attention returned to it. Grand juries convened and dissolved without result, their proceedings heavy with rumor but light on proof. Witnesses contradicted one another, memories shifting subtly with time, each retelling shaped by fear, gossip, and the desire to make sense of what could not be organized. Investigators from outside Villisca arrived with confidence and left with uncertainty, unable to rebuild a crime scene that no longer existed in its original form. The idea began to take hold that the killer had known the house, had moved through it without hesitation, navigating the rooms in darkness with practiced ease. Yet no relationship, no motive, no single figure could be confirmed. The absence of resolution began to define the case more than the violence itself. The murders were no longer just something that had happened. They were something that continued to happen in conversation, in print, in the quiet calculations of people lying awake at night. The Moore house did not remain empty forever. Families tried to live there, to reclaim its rooms with new furniture and fresh routines, but the house resisted them in subtle ways. Doors were found open that had been closed, sounds traveled where no footsteps followed, and sleep came unevenly to those inside. Whether these experiences were born of imagination or memory hardly mattered, because no one stayed long enough to decide. Eventually, the house became less of a home and more of a marker, a physical reminder of an unresolved past. Visitors came not to live, but to stand, to look, to feel the weight of what could not be seen. The town learned to accommodate this attention with practiced restraint, neither fully embracing nor fully rejecting the story that had attached itself to its name. Outside Villisca, the case drifted into a broader landscape of unsolved crimes, often compared to other axe murders scattered across the Midwest during the same era. Similarities were noted, patterns suggested, lines drawn between places that shared nothing but silence and the shape of a weapon. Yet these connections remained speculative, built on absence rather than evidence. Without a confession, without a definitive link, the Villisca murders remained their own closed circle, complete and incomplete at the same time. What endured was the sense of interruption, the feeling that something had entered a safe space, performed its work without resistance, and vanished without leaving a face behind. The house on 2nd Street still stands beneath changing skies, its presence steady, its meaning unresolved, holding within it a quiet that has never fully returned to what it once was. Time altered the edges of the story, but never softened its center. As decades passed, the names involved became less familiar, their lives reduced to outlines repeated in articles and whispered accounts. The Moore children were remembered as ages rather than personalities, the Stillinger sisters as guests rather than girls with futures interrupted. Josiah and Sarah Moore became figures defined by their final night, their ordinary decisions replayed endlessly for meaning they never carried while they were alive. Each retelling stripped away something human and replaced it with distance, yet the unease remained intact. The lack of resolution allowed the imagination to move where facts could not, filling the empty spaces with possibilities that shifted depending on who told the story and when. The house itself aged quietly. Paint peeled and was replaced. Floorboards creaked where they always had. The rooms retained their dimensions, unchanged by the stories told about them. When electricity replaced oil lamps, the light reached corners that had once been held by shadow, but illumination did not bring clarity. If anything, it emphasized how little could be confirmed. The path the killer took through the house was still debated, the order of the rooms still reconstructed and revised, as if repetition might eventually produce certainty. It never did. Each version contradicted the last in some small but crucial way, leaving only the shared understanding that whatever happened occurred without interruption and without witness. Interest in the case returned in cycles, sparked by anniversaries, newly discovered documents, or the confidence of someone convinced they had found the missing piece. Books were written, theories hardened and collapsed. Modern investigators revisited old testimony, applying contemporary logic to century-old confusion, but the foundation remained compromised. Evidence had not merely been lost. It had been undone in real time, altered by curiosity and grief before anyone understood its value. The first hours after the murders, so critical in shaping truth, had been absorbed instead by shock. What followed was not investigation but reaction, and reaction rarely preserves what it touches. Villisca continued its daily life alongside this recurring attention. Children grew up hearing the story as background noise, something present but distant, like a scar on a place rather than a wound. For some, the house became an object of fascination. For others, it remained something to avoid. No single feeling dominated. The town neither claimed nor rejected the history, allowing it to exist without ceremony. In that quiet acceptance, the murders found a permanent place, not as a lesson or a warning, but as an unresolved fact. Inside the house, silence still gathers differently at night. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles into the rooms the way it always has, unchanged by the number of years that have passed since footsteps last crossed the floors with certainty. The events of June 9th remain fixed in time, untouched by explanation, untouched by confession. What entered the house that night left without being named, and what remained has never fully left. The quiet on 2nd Street persists, ordinary on the surface, weighted beneath, holding a pause that has lasted for more than a century. In the absence of answers, the smallest details took on disproportionate weight. The way the curtains had been pulled closed after each room was visited suggested intention rather than instinct, a desire to seal off what had just occurred. The covering of mirrors felt intimate, almost private, as though the killer did not wish to be seen, not by others, not even by himself. These gestures were discussed endlessly, interpreted and reinterpreted, until they began to feel more solid than the facts themselves. Yet gestures explain nothing on their own. They hint, they suggest, they unsettle, but they refuse to resolve. What kind of person takes time after killing, not to escape, but to arrange, to conceal, to linger in a house filled with the bodies of a family? The question hovered without landing, because every possible answer collapsed into speculation. The official record grew thin as the years passed. Files were misplaced, then rediscovered, then misplaced again. Statements taken in urgency were revisited with skepticism, their contradictions laid bare by time. Witnesses aged, then died, carrying with them memories that had never been fully trusted even when they were alive. The possibility of a clear solution receded further with each passing year, not because the truth had changed, but because access to it had narrowed. What remained was a case defined by what could not be confirmed. Every theory required ignoring something else. Every suspect fit only until examined too closely. The murders resisted coherence, maintaining their shape while refusing explanation. The house became a point of convergence for this uncertainty. People who entered it often remarked on its ordinariness, how unremarkable the rooms felt once the weight of history was set aside. And yet that weight always returned. It was present in the way footsteps sounded too loud, in the way darkness gathered unevenly at night, in the sense that the house had once been the center of attention and would never entirely escape it. Attempts to frame the house as a museum, a site of education or remembrance, carried an inherent tension. To preserve it was to acknowledge its past. To ignore it was to deny something that had already shaped it irrevocably. Outside, the world moved on. Wars were fought. Generations turned over. The year 1912 slipped further into abstraction, its people flattened by time into names and dates. But the Villisca murders did not fade in the same way. They remained sharply present, not because they were continually solved and resolved, but because they were not. The lack of resolution kept the story open, suspended in a state that invited return without reward. Each revisit promised clarity and delivered only atmosphere. In the end, what endured was not a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, but a moment stretched unnaturally long. A house at night, a town asleep, a silence entered and never fully restored. The events did not echo loudly, they settled, embedded in place rather than time. 2nd Street continues to exist like any other street, marked by seasons and passing lives, yet the quiet there feels distinct, as if it carries memory without language. The murders remain where they began, inside a house that witnessed everything and explained nothing, holding its stillness without release. After so many years, the story no longer moves forward. It circles. Each return begins with confidence and ends in the same soft collapse, as if the case itself resists being carried to a conclusion. New voices enter the discussion, convinced that distance has made the truth clearer, that time has stripped away distraction. They read old transcripts, study photographs taken too late, trace maps of a house that has never changed its shape. They speak of missed signs and mishandled moments, of how differently things might have unfolded if the first hours had been quieter, more controlled. But the past does not adjust itself to better methods. It remains exactly as it was, shaped by what was done and what was not, and no amount of later care can restore what was lost in those first moments of shock. The psychological weight of the crime lingers most heavily in what it denies. There is no known motive that fits cleanly. Robbery does not explain the patients. Revenge does not explain the children. Madness does not explain the order. Each possibility accounts for something and fails at something else, leaving gaps large enough for doubt to settle into. The killer does not emerge as a character, only as a presence defined by behavior. Calm, unhurried, invisible. That absence of personality is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Without a face, the act stands alone, uncontained by explanation, unsoftened by context. For Villisca, the murders became a fixed point, something that could not be outgrown. Residents learned how to answer questions without answering them, how to acknowledge the history without inviting it inside their daily lives. The town did not freeze in time, but it carried the event forward quietly, folded into its identity without ceremony. Children learned which house it was long before they understood why it mattered. Adults learned to measure their words, aware that every retelling altered the shape of the story just slightly, even when facts were respected. Silence often felt safer than speculation. Inside the Moore house, nothing announces itself. The rooms do not insist on memory. They simply exist. Light moves across walls that have seen too much to explain. Floors hold the weight of footsteps long gone. The sense of intrusion that once defined the space has thinned with time, but it has not disappeared. It lingers in restraint rather than display, in the feeling that something irreversible occurred without leaving behind a reason. Visitors leave with impressions rather than answers, carrying away a quiet discomfort that is difficult to describe and impossible to resolve. The Villisca Axe murders remain unresolved not because they are dramatic, but because they are restrained, because they happened without noise, because they ended without confrontation, because they left behind no voice to explain what entered a sleeping house and moved through it with certainty. What survives is not a conclusion, but a stillness shaped by interruption. A night that began like any other and never truly ended. A house that absorbed a moment and has been holding it ever since, unchanged, waiting without expectation for something that has never arrived. The stillness does not fade, it adjusts. As the years stretch further from the summer of 1912, the murders become less an event and more a condition, something that exists alongside the house rather than behind it. Records describe the weather, the hour, the placement of bodies, but they cannot capture the atmosphere that followed, the way an entire town learned how fragile its sense of safety had been. Villisca did not erupt into chaos. It tightened instead. Conversations shortened. Trust became cautious. Familiar faces were studied longer than before. The idea that violence could arrive without warning and depart, without being seen, settled into the collective mind, altering how the ordinary was understood. The Moore house remains central to that understanding. It is not dramatic in its appearance. It does not rise or dominate the street. Its proportions are modest, its structure practical, built for comfort rather than display. That ordinariness has always been part of its unease. There is nothing about it that suggests it should be remembered, and yet it is. The rooms align as they always have, connected by hallways that once carried quiet footsteps in the dark. The bedrooms remain small, enclosed spaces, where the night would have felt close even before it became dangerous. These are not abstract spaces. They are intimate, and that intimacy cannot be erased by time. Attempts to impose meaning on the crime often return to the same fragments. The absence of forced entry, the choice of weapon, the order of movement. Each fragment suggests control, familiarity, deliberation. But control without context becomes another form of mystery. The killer's certainty contrasts sharply with the uncertainty left behind, as if one side of the night was complete while the other was permanently unfinished. That imbalance persists. It defines every discussion, every theory, every attempt at reconstruction. The murders feel both precise and unresolved, exact in execution and empty of explanation. Even language struggles to contain them. Words like brutal and horrific appear in old articles, but they feel insufficient, almost imprecise. The violence itself was swift, nearly silent. What followed was prolonged and diffuse, spreading through time rather than space. The true disturbance lies not only in what was done, but in how little disturbance it caused at the moment it occurred. 8 lives ended without waking the town. That fact alone resists comprehension. It suggests a vulnerability deeper than locks or walls, something inherent in the assumption that night equals safety. As the case receded further into history, it began to occupy a space between fact and memory. Not myth, but something adjacent to it. The details remained documented, yet their meaning drifted. People argued over interpretations rather than evidence. The murders became a reference point, invoked in discussions of unsolved crimes, of investigative failure, of how easily truth can be compromised at the beginning. But these uses never closed the circle. They only traced it again. Second Street continues to exist in the present tense. Cars pass. Leaves collect along the curb. The house absorbs seasons without reaction. There is no signal that it holds anything other than age. And yet the knowledge remains, embedded rather than displayed. The awareness that something entered there once, completed its task, and left behind no explanation. The quiet that followed was not an ending, but a continuation. It still is. What remains most persistent is the sense of interruption, the feeling that the night of June 9th did not resolve into morning the way nights are meant to. It fractured instead, leaving a seam that never closed. The town woke, the sun rose, and life resumed its shape, but something underneath had shifted. Safety, once assumed, became conditional. Familiarity became suspect. The idea that violence required noise or struggle dissolved. In its place settled a quieter fear, one that did not announce itself but lingered, attentive and unresolved. The Moore house exists within that fracture. It does not relive the night, it contains it. The walls hold no answers, only the memory of having been present. Every object once inside it has been examined, catalogued, reimagined, yet none of them speak. The axe, so central to the story, reveals nothing beyond its use. It does not explain who lifted it, or why it was wiped clean and set aside. It does not explain the patience. It does not explain the restraint. Like everything else connected to the murders, it offers detail without meaning. Those who have studied the case closely often return to the same conclusion without stating it outright. The solution, if it ever existed, was brief. A narrow window of clarity opened and closed within hours. The town, acting out of shock and proximity, stepped into that window and obscured it before anyone understood what was being lost. This is not negligence so much as human instinct. The desire to see, to know, to help overwhelmed the need to preserve. By the time restraint arrived, it was already too late. The house had been handled. The silence had been disturbed. The night had been rewritten. The absence of justice does not manifest as anger here. It manifests as quiet persistence. The case does not demand resolution. It resists it. It remains open not because it is active, but because it cannot be closed without certainty, and certainty never arrived. Each generation inherits the same unanswered questions, stripped of urgency but heavy with implication. The murders become less about finding a culprit and more about confronting the limits of knowing. Some events do not reveal themselves fully, no matter how long they are examined. In Villisca, this understanding has settled into place. The town does not speak of the murders constantly, but it does not forget them either. They exist as a background presence, acknowledged but not performed. The house is there. The story is known. Life continues around it without ceremony. This coexistence feels intentional, a way of allowing the past to remain without allowing it to dominate. The murders are part of the town's shape now, integrated rather than isolated. Night returns to 2nd Street, the way it always has. Darkness falls evenly. Houses grow quiet. Windows reflect little more than shadow. The Moore house does not change under that darkness. It simply accepts it. Whatever entered there once did so without resistance and left without consequence. Whatever remained has never found a voice. The quiet that follows is not empty, but it is contained, held in place by walls that have learned to keep their secrets. The Villisca Axe Murders remain suspended in that quiet. Not solved, not explained, not concluded. They exist as an interruption that never resolved into meaning, a moment absorbed by a house and carried forward through time without release. The night ended. The silence did not. Long after the names of suspects lost their urgency, the details of the night continued to exert their pull. Not the violence itself, but the manner in which it fit so seamlessly into the darkness. There was no chase, no confrontation, no sudden rupture that marked the moment as extraordinary. The house absorbed the presence quietly, the way it had absorbed every other night before it. That continuity is what unsettles most. The murders did not arrive as chaos. They arrived as movement, as familiarity, as something that knew where it was going. In the years following, investigators attempted to impose sequence on the night, to determine the exact order of rooms, the precise timing of each act. But sequence assumes clarity, and clarity was already gone. The lamps had been turned low. The rooms shared walls. Sound would have been muffled by summer air and sleep. What might have been heard was not, and what was not heard became central to the mystery. 8 people killed in close proximity, without alarm. The house remained asleep as it happened. That fact refuses to settle into explanation. It suggests not just opportunity, but control. Control over movement, over sound, over time. The idea that the killer remained inside the house after the murders only deepened that unease. Food was taken. Objects were handled. The scene was altered not to conceal the crime, but to arrange it. This was not an escape. It was a pause, a lingering presence that treated the house not as a site of urgency, but as a place temporarily occupied. That sense of ownership, however brief, is difficult to reconcile. It implies a person who did not feel threatened by discovery, who believed the night belonged to them. Outside the house, Villisca returned to patterns that looked like normal life. Stores opened, trains passed, children attended school. But beneath those patterns ran a quieter recalibration. People learned to listen differently at night, to notice small sounds, to wonder how much could happen without being heard. Doors were locked more often. Windows were checked twice. These changes were subtle, unspoken, but they endured. The crime did not just mark a date, it altered behavior. As the decades advanced, the murders became something people encountered before they fully understood them. Children grew up knowing the house by reputation, sensing its weight before learning its history. By the time they heard the full story, it felt already familiar, as if the knowledge had been waiting. This early awareness blurred the line between memory and inheritance. The murders were remembered by people who had not been alive when they happened, carried forward as part of the town's internal landscape. The house itself continued to receive attention, but never resolution. Those who entered it often expected something dramatic, something that would declare its past unmistakably. Instead, they found rooms that felt quiet to the point of restraint. Nothing insisted on being noticed. That restraint became its own form of presence. The house did not perform its history. It held it. The absence of spectacle made the reality harder to dismiss, not easier. What happened on 2nd Street did not need repetition to remain active. It persisted through implication, through the knowledge that certainty had once been possible and was lost, through the understanding that some acts conclude cleanly while others fracture and remain open. The Villisca murders belong to the latter. They exist without a final frame, without an explanation that seals them into the past. The night continues to exist in fragments. A door opening without force, footsteps that did not wake anyone, curtains drawn against a darkness that had already entered. These fragments do not assemble into clarity. They simply remain suspended. The house stands where it always has, not asking to be understood, not offering anything beyond its continued presence. The silence it holds is not dramatic. It is steady, and it has never been broken. With each passing year, the distance from the crime grows wider, yet the center holds firm. Time erodes urgency, but not unease. The murders no longer belong to the present, but they have never fully receded into the past. They exist in a narrow space where history and immediacy overlap, where the knowledge of what happened does not dull with repetition. The lack of resolution preserves the tension. Nothing settles, nothing closes. The records that survive offer fragments without cohesion. Dates, names, testimony given under pressure. The shape of a house mapped and remapped. Each fragment feels precise on its own, yet none of them align cleanly with the others. Attempts to force them into order only reveal how fragile the structure is. The truth, if it was ever whole, fractured early and scattered. What remains are edges, sharp enough to cut, but never enough to complete the form. The killer's absence becomes its own presence. Without a face or voice, the act stands alone, separated from motive, detached from narrative. It is not framed by confession or consequence. It does not move toward justice or punishment. It simply exists, suspended in a moment that refuses to resolve. That suspension is what gives the crime its endurance. It does not conclude. It persists. Inside the Moore house, ordinary life once unfolded without thought. Meals were eaten. Conversations drifted through rooms. Children moved between spaces without fear. That ordinariness has become inseparable from the crime, not because it was destroyed, but because it was violated without warning. The house did not signal danger. It did not resist. It accepted the night as it always had, and that acceptance was used against it. The betrayal of normalcy remains one of the most difficult aspects to absorb. Visitors who enter the house now often search for something specific. A sensation, a confirmation, a moment that feels different. What they encounter instead is continuity. The rooms do not break character. They do not collapse into memory. They remain consistent, unchanged in purpose, indifferent to expectation. That indifference can feel unsettling. It suggests that what happened there did not alter the house itself, only the meaning imposed upon it. The structure endured. The certainty did not. The story is often described as haunting, but the haunting does not arrive through spectacle. It arrives through restraint, through the awareness that something profoundly disruptive occurred, without leaving behind a corresponding disruption in space. The floors were not torn apart. The walls were not shattered. The house was not abandoned immediately. Life attempted to continue inside it. That attempt failed not because of visible damage, but because of knowledge. Once known, it could not be undone. Villisca continues to exist in the present, but the murders remain threaded through its identity. Not overtly, not constantly, but persistently. They surface in quiet conversations, in the careful phrasing of answers, in the way the house is referred to without explanation. The story no longer needs to be told in full to be understood. Its outline is enough. What happened on that night did not echo outward with force. It settled inward, embedding itself in place rather than time. The house holds that embedding without resistance. It does not release it. It does not reinterpret it. It simply remains. The silence within it is not empty. It is occupied by what was never explained and never corrected. The Villisca Axe Murders endure not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a pause that never resumed. A sequence that began cleanly and ended without closure. A night that passed without noise and left behind a silence that continues to define the space it touched. The house on 2nd Street still stands, unchanged in appearance, carrying forward a moment that time has not loosened and explanation has never reached. Even now, the story does not conclude so much as it thins, stretching farther into quiet speculation. The murders are no longer an active wound, but they are not a scar either. A scar implies healing, an edge that is sealed. This never did. Instead, the event exists like a held breath, something suspended rather than resolved. It waits without expectation, without urgency, without the promise of discovery. That waiting has become part of its shape. The night itself remains strangely intact in memory, reconstructed again and again without becoming clearer. June air moving through open windows. Beds arranged for comfort. The small courtesy of inviting guests to stay rather than walk home in the dark. These details are gentle, almost tender, and they sharpen the contrast without exaggeration. Nothing about the evening suggests danger. Nothing signals interruption. The transition from safety to violence occurs without a visible threshold. One state simply gives way to the other, and that seamlessness resists understanding. Investigators once believed that time would loosen tongues, that someone would eventually speak. It did not happen. Silence outlasted suspicion. Those who might have known something carried it quietly, if they carried anything at all. And as years passed, even that possibility dimmed. Death closed mouths. Distance softened urgency. The chance of revelation did not vanish dramatically. It diminished gradually, until it became theoretical rather than real. What survives instead is atmosphere, the sense of a presence defined entirely by action and absence. The killer is remembered not as a person, but as a movement through space, a series of decisions made without hesitation. Enter, take, move, cover, leave. These verbs carry more weight than any name ever did. They form a pattern that feels complete in execution, and incomplete in meaning. The imbalance remains unresolved. The Moore House absorbs this imbalance without protest. It does not reject the story, nor does it advertise it. It exists in a state of quiet accommodation, holding its past without performing it. Light falls through its windows as it always has. Dust settles, floorboards flex under familiar pressure. Nothing in its structure demands interpretation. The unease comes not from what the house does, but from what it refuses to do. It does not explain. It does not correct. It does not forget. 2nd Street continues to host ordinary lives. People arrive and leave. Seasons mark time. The street does not pause for history, and yet history remains there, layered beneath the present without intruding upon it. The knowledge of what occurred does not dominate the space, but it alters how the space is perceived. Ordinary quiet becomes weighted. Familiar stillness feels conditional. The Villisca Axe Murders do not ask to be solved anymore. They exist beyond that demand. They occupy a space where questions no longer expect answers, where uncertainty has settled into permanence. The story has reached a point where resolution is no longer the absence that defines it. Instead, it is the endurance of silence. The night ended long ago. Morning came. Lives continued, but something remained suspended in that house, held in place by walls that witnessed without responding. The quiet that followed did not signal peace. It signaled containment, and it has held uninterrupted through every year since. The longer the story is carried, the more it sheds the need for explanation. It no longer strains toward clarity or waits for a missing piece to surface. Instead, it settles into repetition, not of facts but of presence. The murders exist as something already complete, already finished in their execution, yet permanently unfinished in their meaning. That contradiction has become their defining feature. Nothing new alters it. Nothing resolves it. The idea that the killer was never interrupted continues to hover at the center of every retelling. No sudden noise, no unexpected movement, no moment that forced haste. The night unfolded according to a single will, uninterrupted by resistance or discovery. This absence of disruption is more unsettling than any act of violence itself. It suggests a vulnerability so complete that it barely registers as vulnerability at all. The house did what houses are meant to do. It sheltered, it enclosed, it trusted the night, and that trust was exploited without effort. Over time, the murders became less about who committed them and more about what they revealed. Not in a moral sense, not as a lesson, but as a quiet exposure of limits. Limits of protection, limits of investigation, limits of memory. The case demonstrates how easily certainty can be undone, how quickly truth can scatter when touched too soon, too often, by too many hands. Once scattered, it does not reassemble itself. It remains distributed across time, inaccessible as a whole. The town absorbed this reality without ceremony. There were no rituals of closure, no definitive markers of ending. Life adjusted instead, subtly and permanently. People learned to live alongside an unanswered question, without insisting that it be answered. The murders became part of the town's background, like an old structure no longer used but never demolished. Present, acknowledged, and quietly avoided. Inside the Moore house, the rooms continue to exist without distinction. No room announces its role in the night. No space carries more weight than another. The bedrooms are simply bedrooms. The hallways are simply connectors. This neutrality is deceptive. It allows the imagination to move freely, unconstrained by emphasis or guidance. The house does not tell the story. It allows the story to exist. The persistence of the case does not come from revelation, but from restraint. Nothing was taken too far. Nothing was explained too much. The murders resist both sensationalism and resolution, occupying a narrow space where attention lingers without satisfaction. The silence they produced was not explosive. It was cumulative. It built slowly, year after year, reinforced by the absence of an ending. Second Street does not mark the night in any visible way. There is no signal, no interruption in its function. It continues to do what streets do. It carries people past the same structures, day after day, while history remains fixed within one of them. The coexistence of movement and stillness is complete. Neither overwhelms the other. What entered the Moore house that night did not announce itself and did not explain itself. It completed its actions and withdrew, leaving behind a space that would never fully return to innocence or collapse into ruin. The house remains balanced between those states, intact but altered, ordinary but irrevocably marked. The Villisca Axe Murders persist as an event without an ending, not because the ending is hidden, but because it never arrived. The story does not close. It does not conclude. It remains where it has always been, contained within a house that learned how to hold silence and has never released it. The passage of time has not diminished the weight of that silence. It has refined it. What was once raw shock has settled into something steadier, something less volatile but more enduring. The murders no longer provoke immediate fear, yet they continue to unsettle in a quieter way through their refusal to resolve. They occupy a space where curiosity and acceptance overlap, where the desire to know exists alongside the understanding that knowing may never come. This balance has become permanent. The house has learned this balance well. It stands without urgency, without appeal. It does not demand attention, and yet it draws it inevitably. Those who approach it often do so with an awareness shaped by distance, by years of retelling that have stripped away immediacy while preserving unease. What they encounter is not drama, but restraint. The absence of spectacle becomes its own statement. Nothing insists on being seen. Nothing insists on being remembered. And yet memory remains unavoidable. The murders resist transformation into something else. They do not become myth because the facts are too grounded. They do not become history alone because the uncertainty keeps them active. They exist instead as a fixed interruption, an event that does not expand or contract with time. It remains the same size, occupying the same space, exerting the same pressure. This consistency is rare. Most stories soften or sharpen with repetition. This one simply endures. The lack of a final act leaves the narrative suspended. There is no arrest that reframes the night, no confession that reshapes intention. Without these anchors, the story cannot move forward. It can only be revisited. Each return follows the same path and ends in the same place, not with revelation, but with recognition. The understanding that some events conclude only in their occurrence, not in their explanation. Villisca has carried this understanding forward without spectacle. The town does not define itself by the murders, but it does not deny them either. They remain present in the way silence is treated, in the respect given to unanswered things. There is no attempt to fill the gap left behind. The gap is allowed to exist. This acceptance has become part of the town's quiet resilience. The Moore House continues to hold what it was given. It does not interpret the past. It does not comment on it. It simply contains it, as it contained everything else that ever passed through its rooms. That containment has proven stronger than time, stronger than investigation, stronger than explanation. The house has become a vessel not for answers, but for endurance. Night returns to 2nd Street again and again, unchanged in form, indifferent to history. The house receives it without reaction. Darkness gathers, quiet settles, nothing announces itself, nothing departs. The moment remains where it has always been, suspended between occurrence and understanding. The Villisca Axe Murders do not seek resolution anymore. They persist without demand, held in place by silence and restraint. The night passed, the house remained, and within it something unfinished continues to exist, not waiting to be discovered, but simply continuing, intact and unresolved, exactly as it has for more than a century. What endures most clearly is how little the night needed to announce itself. There was no spectacle to draw attention, no sound to fracture sleep across the street. The violence did not radiate outward. It folded inward, contained by walls that had never learned to refuse entry. That containment is what allowed the murders to remain intact for so long, not as evidence, but as atmosphere. The event did not scatter itself across the town. It concentrated itself in one place and stayed there. The Moore House became, over time, a point where certainty dissolved. People could agree on what had happened in broad terms, but the closer they moved toward specifics, the less solid those specifics became. Timelines blurred, movements overlapped, assumptions filled the gaps left by missing information. The more carefully the night was examined, the less cooperative it became. It did not reveal patterns so much as it resisted them, offering only repetition without explanation. There is a particular unease in crimes that end without pursuit. Nothing was chased, nothing was followed. The killer did not flee into the distance under pressure. The departure was as quiet as the arrival, absorbed by darkness without resistance. That absence of motion afterward left the town with nowhere to direct its attention. Fear had no clear destination. Suspicion lingered without focus. The energy of the crime had nowhere to go, so it settled instead. The victims themselves gradually receded into outlines, remembered through the stillness, left behind rather than the lives that preceded it. Their routines, their voices, their daily presence were replaced by the single fact of their absence. What they had been doing the day before, the conversations they had not finished, the plans that would not occur. These details remained unknowable, not because they were secret, but because they no longer mattered to the story as it hardened. The crime flattened them into symbols without intention, reducing lives to positions in rooms, to placements in beds, to names repeated in sequence. This reduction was not deliberate. It was the result of time pressing against an unresolved event. Without an ending, the story had nowhere to place its weight except on the moment itself. Everything before faded. Everything after stalled. The murders existed in isolation, disconnected from both cause and consequence. That isolation gave them their permanence. The house accepted this permanence without change. It did not become a ruin. It did not collapse under meaning. It remained structurally sound, functional, ordinary. That ordinariness continued to unsettle because it contradicted expectation. Places marked by violence are often imagined as visibly altered, as if trauma must reshape physical space. The Moore House refused that transformation. It kept its shape, its proportions, its neutrality. Meaning attached itself to it from the outside, not from within. As attention came and went, the house learned to endure scrutiny without yielding. Each examination promised clarity and delivered only more quiet. Each attempt to define the night resulted in further narrowing, not expansion. The story compressed rather than unfolded. It became denser, heavier, more resistant to interpretation. Silence did not dissipate with use. It thickened. 2nd Street remained a place of passage. People walked past. Cars slowed, then continued. Life threaded itself around the house without confrontation. The murders did not interrupt the street's function, only its perception. The knowledge of what had happened altered how stillness was felt, how darkness was measured. Ordinary quiet became charged, not with threat but with awareness. The Villisca Axe Murders persist in this narrowed state. They do not sprawl across time. They remain contained within a single night that never fully resolved. The absence of explanation has not weakened the story. It has strengthened it, fixing it in place without release. The house continues to stand, holding a silence that does not ask to be broken and does not offer itself to be understood. As the story settles further into time, it becomes clear that nothing new enters it. No discovery alters its shape. No revelation interrupts its stillness. The murders remain sealed within the conditions of their occurrence, untouched by progress, unaffected by distance. They do not belong to an era of crude investigation or limited communication. They belong to a moment that collapsed inward, taking its clarity with it. Everything afterward has been an attempt to listen to what no longer speaks. The night itself feels increasingly self-contained. The killer's movement through the house appears complete, uninterrupted by uncertainty. Each action followed another without deviation, suggesting not improvisation, but intention carried out without resistance. The absence of interruption becomes the defining feature. No one woke, no one ran, no one intervened. The house did not protest. The town did not stir. The violence existed entirely within the boundaries of sleep, where awareness dissolves and control belongs to whoever remains conscious. That boundary is what makes the crime endure. Sleep represents trust in the world continuing as expected. The murders violated that trust without noise, without struggle, without visible force. They revealed how thin the barrier was between safety and intrusion. This realization did not need to be spoken, allowed to take hold. It settled quietly, altering perception rather than behavior, awareness rather than routine. The Moore House remains the physical center of this awareness. It does not memorialize the night. It does not reinterpret it. It simply remains available to memory. Each room retains its proportions. Each doorway opens where it always has. Nothing signals the past, except the knowledge carried in by those who enter. The house itself contributes nothing beyond its continued presence. That neutrality gives the story its weight. The space refuses to assist in understanding what occurred within it. As attention faded and returned in cycles, the murders became less about discovery and more about endurance. They survived not because they were continually examined, but because they were never resolved. Resolution would have allowed them to settle into history. Instead, they remain adjacent to the present, always slightly removed, always intact. The story does not age in the way others do. It does not soften. It does not sharpen. It holds. Villisca adapted to this holding without ceremony. The town did not seek to frame the murders as a defining trait, nor did it attempt to erase them. They exist as an acknowledged absence, a space where explanation should be but is not. This absence is treated with restraint, as something that does not require constant attention to remain real. Silence does the work instead. The persistence of the case lies not in its mystery, but in its containment. Everything that needed to happen occurred within a single night. Everything that failed to happen followed immediately after. Since then, nothing has altered that balance. The murders are complete in action and incomplete in meaning. That contradiction has never resolved. The house on 2nd Street continues to hold this contradiction without movement. It does not lean toward interpretation. It does not invite speculation. It simply exists as it always has, allowing time to pass around it without interference. The night that entered it did not leave a mark that could be measured. It left a silence that could not be removed. That silence remains steady, not dramatic, not demanding, simply present. It does not call for answers. It does not promise them. It continues to occupy the space it claimed long ago, uninterrupted, unchanged, and unresolved. The quiet that surrounds the case has become inseparable from it. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of something settled too deeply to surface. Over time, even the urge to assign meaning has grown softer. The murders no longer provoke urgency, they provoke stillness. They exist as a fixed weight, something that does not press forward or pull back, but remains exactly where it was placed. The story does not advance. It rests. The absence of a voice is central. No account emerged from the darkness. No explanation followed the act. The killer did not speak through letters or gestures afterward. There was no attempt to shape the narrative. What happened was allowed to stand on its own, stripped of commentary. This refusal to communicate, whether intentional or incidental, sealed the event in its raw state. Without interpretation, the act remains opaque. Without language, it resists transformation. The Moore House holds this opacity without distortion. It does not amplify the past. It does not diminish it. The walls neither echo nor absorb explanation. They simply remain, bearing no responsibility for what they witnessed. The neutrality of the space sharpens the unease. There is no visible difference between before and after, no physical signal that marks the point of rupture. The house appears as it always did, and that continuity unsettles more than decay ever could. Those who stand inside it often remark on how ordinary it feels. The rooms do not perform memory. They allow it. The silence does not announce itself. It reveals itself gradually, through duration rather than intensity. The longer one remains, the more apparent it becomes that nothing is being offered. No clue, no sensation, no insight, only the knowledge that something occurred and was never answered. The murders exist now almost entirely in this space, between knowing and understanding. The facts are accessible. The interpretations are endless. The truth remains unreachable. This separation has hardened over time, forming a boundary that investigation can approach but never cross. The story no longer invites resolution. It exists beyond that need, sustained by the very absence it created. Second Street continues to host movement without interruption. Life passes through it daily, indifferent to what it contains. The house remains among others, neither isolated nor integrated, simply present. Its meaning is carried by those who know, not by the structure itself. Without that knowledge, it is only a house. With it, it becomes something held apart by silence. The Villisca Axe Murders remain exactly where they began. Not evolving, not dissolving, not concluding. They persist as a moment that never released its grip on place. A night that entered quietly and never fully departed. The house did not close itself afterward. The town did not collapse. The world did not stop. But something stayed behind, settled into stillness, and learned how to endure without explanation. That endurance continues, quietly, uninterrupted. The endurance of the case has taught restraint to everyone who carries it. There is no longer a rush to define, no insistence on certainty. The murders are approached indirectly now, through atmosphere rather than argument, through what can be felt rather than proven. The night is revisited not to solve it, but to acknowledge its permanence. This shift has softened the edges without dulling the weight. The story has learned how to exist without pressure. The boundaries of that night remain precise. A house, a street, a town asleep. Nothing expands beyond those limits. The violence did not spill outward into chaos or spectacle. It remained contained, disciplined by silence. That containment has shaped every retelling since. The absence of expansion denies the story momentum, and without momentum, there is no arc toward resolution. The murders exist as a closed shape, complete in outline and empty at the center. Attempts to animate the story often return to the same fragments, rearranged but unchanged. The placement of the axe, the order of rooms, the covered mirrors. These details circulate without progress, not because they are unimportant, but because they lead nowhere. They describe action without revealing intention. They outline behavior without disclosing identity. Each detail adds density without adding direction. The house accommodates this density with ease. It does not strain under the accumulation of meaning. It does not resist it either. It stands in balance, neither expressive nor mute, offering no more than its continued presence. This equilibrium has become its defining quality. The house is not a symbol. It is a container. It holds what was placed inside it, and nothing else. Over time, the murders have become less a story than a condition. They shape how stillness is interpreted, how quiet is measured. They exist as a reference point for unease, a reminder that not all events announce themselves or conclude neatly. This understanding does not fade. It settles into awareness, altering perception without demanding attention. Villisca continues to live alongside this condition. The town has learned how to carry an unresolved history without performing it. The murders are neither hidden nor displayed. They remain present in the careful neutrality of conversation, in the absence of emphasis. This restraint has preserved the story more effectively than repetition ever could. Night returns again and again to Second Street. The pattern does not change. Darkness gathers. Houses close themselves to the day. The morehouse receives the night as it always has, without anticipation or reaction. Whatever entered it once does not return. Whatever remained does not leave. The story does not move forward from here. It does not need to. It has reached a state of equilibrium, held in place by silence and time. The Villisca Axe Murders persist not as a puzzle awaiting solution, but as a moment that settled into place and stayed there, intact and unyielding, continuing without conclusion. The quiet has become so complete that it no longer feels temporary. It feels structural, built into the story the way walls are built into a house. Nothing presses against it. Nothing breaks through. The murders exist within this quiet not as noise remembered, but as absence maintained. They do not echo. They do not reverberate. They remain still, preserved by the very lack of response they received. What happened that night required no confrontation. There was no moment where the night resisted its own interruption. Sleep held the house in place, suspended between awareness and vulnerability. That suspension allowed everything to occur without friction. It was not chaos that enabled the crime, but order. Routine, familiarity, the predictable shape of a night that had unfolded the same way countless times before. The violence did not disrupt that order until it was already complete. This is what makes the story difficult to release. It offers no dramatic hinge, no turning point where meaning shifts. The night does not divide cleanly into before and after. It slides instead from one state into another, unnoticed until it is irreversible. By the time morning arrived, the transition had already settled into permanence. Nothing could return it to what it had been. The Moore house continues to embody that transition without comment. It does not indicate where the night changed. It does not privilege one room over another. Every space remains equally ordinary. That equality denies emphasis. It prevents the story from anchoring itself to a single point. The absence of a focal rupture spreads the weight evenly, making the entire house complicit in holding the silence. As attention thins with time, the murders remain unaffected. They do not depend on being remembered loudly. They endure through containment, through the refusal to resolve, through the understanding that some events end only in fact, not an explanation. This endurance does not require renewal. It is sustained by what never happened afterward. The lack of an ending has become the ending, not in a narrative sense, but in a structural one. The story stops where it should continue. That stoppage has held firm against decades of scrutiny. It does not weaken. It does not invite collapse. It remains fixed, resistant to completion. Second Street continues to receive the night without ceremony. Darkness arrives. Quiet follows. The pattern repeats. The house does nothing to distinguish itself. It does not mark anniversaries. It does not acknowledge passage. It remains consistent, offering the same stillness it always has. That consistency has become its final form. What occurred there does not fade, because it was never allowed to finish unfolding. It remains in suspension, a completed act without a completed meaning. The Villisca Axe Murders do not resolve. They do not retreat. They remain exactly where they settled, held in silence, continuing without movement, without explanation, and without end. The longer the silence is held, the more it defines the space around it. It reshapes expectation. It teaches patience without reward. In the Villisca case, silence is not a pause between answers. It is the final condition. The murders do not feel unfinished because something is missing. They feel unfinished because nothing followed. No response matched the precision of what occurred. No consequence balanced the certainty of the act itself. The night did not fracture into chaos afterward. It simply withdrew. The killer left no trace that demanded pursuit, no disruption that forced immediate reckoning. The house absorbed the absence as easily as it had absorbed the presence. By the time attention arrived, the essential moment had already passed. What remained was interpretation layered onto loss, an attempt to reconstruct something that no longer existed in its original form. This delay shaped everything. It ensured that the truth, whatever it had been, would never stand alone. It would always be filtered through reaction, through memory, through fear. The murders were never encountered cleanly. They were discovered already altered, already surrounded. That contamination did not end with the first day. It continued subtly, through retellings, through assumptions that hardened into belief, through the gradual replacement of certainty with familiarity. The Moore house did not resist this process. It offered no correction. It did not preserve the night in a way that could be accessed. It allowed the story to attach itself without guiding it. Over time, the house became less a source of information and more a boundary. Inside it, the story stopped moving. Outside it, interpretation multiplied. The divide remained absolute. Those who return to the case often sense this immediately. There is a feeling that the center cannot be reached, that the closer one moves, the less distinct it becomes. The murders do not sharpen under scrutiny. They blur. Details lose edges. Motives dissolve. The story contracts inward, leaving only the outline of what occurred and the certainty that it cannot be entered again. This is not frustration so much as condition. The case does not provoke urgency anymore. It provokes recognition. The recognition that some acts conclude in silence and remain there. The recognition that explanation is not guaranteed by time or attention. The recognition that endurance does not require understanding. Villisca has lived with this recognition for generations. The town has not been consumed by the murders, but it has not outpaced them either. They exist as a constant beneath the surface, shaping how stillness is perceived, how quiet is respected. The house remains part of that quiet, neither isolated nor absorbed, simply present. Night continues to arrive without variation. Darkness settles evenly. The Moore house receives it as it always has. Nothing moves. Nothing announces itself. The silence holds. And in that silence, the story remains exactly where it stopped, unchanged, unspoken, and unresolved, continuing not through answers, but through the simple fact of its persistence. The persistence of the case lies in how completely it refuses transformation. It does not evolve into warning or lesson. It does not resolve into clarity or collapse into myth. It remains fixed, occupying the same narrow space it claimed the moment the night ended. That refusal has preserved it more effectively than any record ever could. The murders exist as a constant, not demanding attention, not releasing it either. What remains striking is how little resistance the night encountered. Not from the house, not from the town, not from circumstance. Everything aligned in silence. Sleep held its shape. Distance held its quiet. Time moved forward without disturbance. The event did not bend its surroundings. It passed through them without friction. That absence of resistance is what allowed it to settle so deeply. There was nothing to push it back out. The Moore house continues to reflect this absence of resistance. It does not assert meaning. It does not withhold it either. It exists without posture, without emphasis. Its neutrality has outlasted every theory applied to it. No interpretation has altered the way its rooms feel, or the way its walls stand. The house has not absorbed explanation. It has only absorbed time. As years accumulate, the murders become less a subject of inquiry and more a measure of endurance. They demonstrate how something can remain present without renewal, how an event can persist without being reactivated. The story does not need retelling to survive. It survives through stillness, through the fact that it was never concluded, through the knowledge that what was lost was not only life, but the possibility of understanding. The lack of a clear beginning or end leaves the narrative suspended in a continuous present. The night does not recede. It does not advance. It simply remains available, unchanged by distance. This availability is not inviting. It is inert. It offers nothing new, nothing hidden. It offers only the same silence it has always held. Second Street exists alongside this inertia, without conflict. The street functions. The town functions. Life passes through the space without interruption. The murders do not intrude. They do not assert themselves. They remain embedded, altering perception rather than behavior. The quiet there is not louder than elsewhere. It is heavier. What entered the Moore house that night did not leave behind a story that could be shaped. It left behind a condition that could only be carried. That condition has proven stable. It has not eroded. It has not intensified. It has simply remained. The Villisca Axe Murders do not conclude, because they do not require conclusion to exist. They persist through containment, through restraint, through the absence of explanation. The night ended. The house remained. And within that stillness, the moment continues, unaltered by time, untouched by certainty, held in place by silence that has never learned how to give way. Eventually, the story reaches a point where even repetition becomes unnecessary. The outlines are known. The spaces are familiar. The absence has settled so completely that it no longer calls attention to itself. The murders remain present not because they are remembered actively, but because they were never finished properly. They occupy a state beyond recall, embedded rather than recalled, held in place by what never followed. The night itself has become less a sequence of actions and more a condition of stillness. It exists without urgency, without escalation. There is no peak, no collapse. The moment does not rise or fall. It simply persists, unchanged by the passing of years. That persistence denies the story momentum. It prevents resolution not through mystery, but through completion that arrived too soon, an explanation that never arrived at all. The Moore house continues to function as a container for this condition. It does not interpret the night. It does not preserve it in a way that can be accessed. It simply holds the space where it occurred. The walls have not learned to speak. The rooms do not differentiate themselves. Everything remains evenly quiet, as if the house itself has adapted to holding something unresolved without strain. Those who know the story often describe a sense of distance when thinking about it, not emotional distance, but spatial distance. The feeling that the center cannot be approached, that the closer one moves, the less tangible it becomes. The murders resist intimacy. They do not allow themselves to be fully imagined or fully understood. They remain partially obscured, not by lack of information, but by lack of entry. This resistance has preserved the case more effectively than certainty ever could. A solution would have fixed the story in time, allowing it to age, to soften, to pass into history. The absence of one has kept it suspended. It does not belong to the past in the way resolved events do. It remains adjacent to the present, always reachable, never accessible. Villisca has continued alongside this adjacency, without confrontation. The town does not reenact the story. It does not attempt to outgrow it. It simply exists with it, allowing the unresolved to remain unresolved. This coexistence has become unremarkable, which may be its most lasting effect. The extraordinary has been absorbed into the ordinary, without ceremony. Night continues to return to 2nd Street. The pattern holds. Darkness gathers. Quiet settles. The house receives it without reaction. Nothing signals that anything should change. Nothing suggests that it will. The Villisca Axe Murders remain where they have always been, contained within a night that concluded in action and opened into silence. That silence has never been broken, only carried forward, steady and intact, through every year that followed. The carrying forward has become almost invisible. The murders no longer feel like an event remembered, but like a presence accommodated. They exist without demand, without insistence. No effort is required to keep them alive in memory, because memory is no longer doing the work. Place is. The house holds what time did not resolve, and time has learned to move around it rather than through it. What is most striking, after so long, is how little has changed in the essential shape of the story. No new fact has shifted the balance. No revelation has tilted the weight towards certainty. Everything that could be known appears already known, and everything that cannot be known has settled into permanence. The murders do not invite fresh interpretation. They resist it. Each return arrives at the same stillness, the same narrowing, the same refusal to open further. The night itself feels sealed, not hidden but closed. It does not respond to inquiry. It does not yield under pressure. The sequence of actions exists, but meaning does not follow. The killer's path through the house remains defined by movement rather than motive. Entering rooms, standing over beds, acting without interruption, leaving without trace. These actions are complete. What they signify is not. The Moore house continues to reflect this completeness without explanation. It does not amplify fear. It does not dull it. The rooms remain proportionate, functional, unchanged in purpose. Their neutrality denies the comfort of symbolism. Nothing points, nothing emphasizes. The house refuses to guide interpretation, leaving silence to do what it does best: remain. As time presses on, the murders become less associated with violence and more with restraint. They are remembered not for chaos, but for control. Not for noise, but for quiet. This inversion unsettles without exhausting itself. Loud crimes fade. Quiet ones endure. The absence of spectacle has allowed the story to remain intact, untouched by exaggeration, resistant to erosion. 2nd Street continues to exist without pause. It does not slow for memory. It does not acknowledge anniversaries. It holds the house, among others, without distinction. Yet the knowledge remains, carried silently by those who know where to look and what once occurred. That knowledge alters nothing visible and everything internal. There is no moment when the story asks to be finished. It does not seek resolution. It does not suggest closure. It exists in a state beyond those concepts, sustained by the fact that nothing ever arrived to end it. The murders stopped. The explanation did not. The night passed. Morning came. Years accumulated. And still within the walls of that house, something remains suspended, not waiting, not fading, simply continuing, unchanged and unchallenged, held in silence that has learned how to last. The silence has become self-sustaining. It no longer depends on attention or neglect. It exists on its own terms, settled into the place where the night ended and nothing followed. The murders do not ask to be revisited, yet they remain available, held in reserve by the absence of conclusion. They are not dormant. They are complete in their stillness. What has endured is the imbalance between certainty and explanation. The actions are clear enough to be repeated without change. The motives remain untouched by clarity. This imbalance creates a pressure that never resolves, a quiet tension that does not seek release. It does not build toward revelation. It simply holds. The night did what it did, and the world never caught up to it. The Moore house continues to stand as a neutral witness. It does not remember in a human sense. It does not forget. It occupies a position outside narrative, where time passes without altering significance. The rooms do not change their character. The walls do not absorb meaning. They contain space, and that space contains a moment that cannot be unfolded further. The house does not insist on its history. It allows it to remain. Over generations, the story has thinned to its essentials. A family, a night, a house, an act without interruption. Everything else has either dissolved or repeated itself into familiarity. This reduction has not simplified the story. It has hardened it. What remains cannot be refined any further without breaking into speculation, and speculation has long since proven insufficient. The absence of resolution has become a boundary rather than a gap. It defines where understanding must stop. Those who approach it feel the limit immediately. The story does not invite crossing. It holds its shape and refuses expansion. In this way, it protects itself from distortion. It remains what it is, neither growing nor shrinking under scrutiny. Villisca exists alongside this boundary without friction. The town does not test it. It does not push against it. The murders have been absorbed into the local awareness as something fixed, something that does not require engagement to remain real. Silence has become the accepted response, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Night continues to arrive without variation. The house receives it without acknowledgement. Darkness settles evenly. Quiet follows. Nothing signals that anything should be different. Nothing suggests that the story is incomplete, even though it is. The lack of an ending has become part of the structure, as stable as the walls that hold it. The Villisca Axe Murders remain suspended in this state, not fading, not escalating, not concluding. They exist as an interruption that never resolved into meaning, a moment that closed itself to explanation and remained closed. The house stands, the street endures, the silence holds, and the story stays exactly where it has always been, intact and unresolved, carried forward without movement, without voice, and without end. What remains after all this time is not tension, but density. The story has compacted itself, pressed inward until nothing extraneous remains. There are no loose threads, no dramatic turns left unexplored. Everything that could be said has already been said, and everything that mattered occurred within a span of hours that never expanded beyond itself. The murders endure because they do not unravel. They hold. The night did not leave behind momentum. It left behind stillness. That stillness has proven remarkably durable. It does not erode with familiarity. It does not soften with age. It adapts, becoming quieter, less visible, more deeply embedded. The murders no longer stand out sharply against their surroundings. They blend into them, altering perception rather than demanding focus. The Moore house continues to exist as a point of containment. It does not isolate the event, it anchors it. The walls mark where the night unfolded and where it stopped. Nothing beyond them carries the same weight. The story does not spill outward. It remains fixed within those boundaries, as if held there by agreement rather than force. The house does not trap the past. It accommodates it. Those who approach the case now often sense that it has reached a kind of equilibrium. Not peace, not resolution, but balance. The questions and the absence of answers hold equal weight. Neither overwhelms the other. This balance has allowed the story to persist without escalation. It does not need new attention to survive. It has already settled into permanence. The town has adapted to this permanence without altering its rhythm. Villisca continues to function as it always has, its daily life untouched on the surface. The murders exist beneath that surface, not hidden, not displayed, simply present. They do not interrupt. They do not intrude. They remained. Night continues to fall on 2nd Street. The sequence never changes. Light fades. Quiet gathers. The house stands among others, indistinguishable without knowledge, unmistakable with it. Nothing marks the passing of time inside its walls. Nothing announces memory. The stillness does not thicken or thin. It holds. What happened there does not seek explanation anymore. It does not wait for discovery. It exists as it is, complete in action, incomplete in meaning, sustained by the silence that followed and never broke. The murders remain contained within that silence, neither advancing nor retreating, continuing without conclusion, exactly as they have for more than a century. The continuation no longer feels like movement through a story, but like standing within it. The sense of progression dissolves, replaced by a sustained awareness that nothing ahead will differ from what already exists. The murders have reached a state where time adds nothing and subtracts nothing. They remain fixed, not because they are preserved, but because they were never allowed to resolve into something else. The night itself has become abstracted, stripped of urgency and sequence. It exists as a condition rather than an event. A house asleep, a presence awake, a sequence carried out without interruption. That is all that remains. The surrounding details, whether our routine, have faded into background texture. The center holds without decoration, violence without chaos, completion without conclusion. The Moore house continues to hold this condition without strain. It does not resist being ordinary. It does not collapse into significance. The rooms remain usable, navigable, unchanged in purpose. That usability is what unsettles most. The space did not break. It absorbed. It continued. The house did not mark itself as a site of rupture. It allowed the rupture to exist within it, without altering its outward form. This refusal to transform has preserved the story more effectively than any monument or marker ever could. The absence of visible acknowledgement keeps the past close. Nothing separates then from now except knowledge. Without that knowledge, the house is simply a house. With it, the stillness becomes weighted, not dramatic, not oppressive, but exact. Over time, the murders have ceased to behave like a mystery and begun to behave like a constant. They do not provoke investigation so much as recognition. Recognition that explanation is not inevitable. Recognition that some acts complete themselves fully and leave nothing behind that can be followed. Recognition that silence can be durable. The town exists comfortably within this recognition. There is no sense of unfinished business pressing forward. The absence has been accommodated. The story does not intrude upon daily life because it no longer competes with it. It exists alongside it, parallel, unchanged. The murders do not need attention to persist. They persist because they never concluded. Second Street continues to receive the night in the same way it always has. Darkness arrives evenly. Quiet settles without announcement. The Moore house does not distinguish itself. It does not signal memory. It does not demand acknowledgement. It remains. The story does not move beyond this point because it cannot. There is no further distance to travel. Everything essential has already occurred. What remains is containment. The night ended. The silence followed. And within that silence, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to exist exactly as they settled, complete in action, incomplete in meaning, unchanged by time, and held in place by a quiet that never learned how to give way. The stillness has become familiar enough to feel intentional, as though the story itself chose this form and refuses to be reshaped. Nothing pulls it forward, nothing pushes it back. It remains in balance, sustained by the absence of interference. The murders do not need reinforcement through shock or novelty. They persist because they were never interrupted, never corrected, never answered. What was done remained done. What was not done remained undone. The night has lost its edges. It no longer feels sharp or immediate. It feels sealed, like something preserved not by effort, but by neglect. The lack of response hardened it. The absence of resolution allowed it to set. Each passing year added weight rather than distance, pressing the event deeper into place instead of carrying it away. Time did not erode the silence. It compacted it. The Moore house reflects this compaction without resistance. It does not creak under memory. It does not sag beneath implication. The structure remains steady, unchanged in purpose and form. The rooms do not differentiate themselves by importance or gravity. Each one holds the same quiet, the same neutrality. This evenness denies hierarchy. It refuses to point. The house does not tell the story. It contains it evenly, without emphasis. What occurred there has become inseparable from the space, not because the space remembers, but because nothing replaced what was lost. No conclusion arrived to overwrite the moment. No explanation came to reframe it. The night remained intact, held in place by its own completion. The act ended. The meaning did not begin. The murders now exist in a state beyond inquiry, not because they are protected, but because they are finished in the only way they ever would be. The path into understanding has closed, not abruptly, but gradually, until it simply stopped being accessible. What remains is not a puzzle, but a condition, a silence that holds shape. Second Street continues to function without acknowledgement. The street does not absorb the weight. It does not display it. Life passes through without pause. The house remains among others, indistinguishable unless known. The distinction exists only in awareness, not in appearance. The story requires knowledge to be felt. Without it, the quiet is ordinary. The Villisca Axe Murders remain fixed within this ordinary quiet. They do not press outward. They do not recede inward. They exist in place, steady and unyielding, unchanged by time or attention. The night concluded in action. The silence that followed concluded nothing. It simply stayed. The silence has outlived every attempt to frame it. It has proven more durable than explanation, more stable than theory. What began as absence has become structure, a fixed element of the story that cannot be removed without dismantling everything around it. The murders no longer feel unresolved in the way unfinished stories do. They feel resolved into silence, sealed by the lack of response that followed them. The night offered no resistance and asked for none. It accepted what entered and released it again without trace. That exchange was brief, efficient, complete. The aftermath, by contrast, stretched indefinitely, not because it expanded, but because it never closed. The imbalance between action and response has remained untouched. The act finished itself. The world did not. The Moore house continues to exist within this imbalance, without strain. It does not lean toward the past. It does not distance itself from it. The rooms remain aligned, proportioned for living, not remembering. This refusal to transform into a monument has kept the past unusually close. There is no boundary separating what happened from what followed, only the thin layer of knowledge carried by those who know. What makes the story endure is not its brutality, but its restraint. The violence did not announce itself. The silence did not break afterward. Nothing insisted on being understood. This lack of insistence has allowed the murders to settle into place without distortion. They have not been inflated by spectacle or reduced by familiarity. They remain exact in their quiet. Over time, even the urge to name the unknown has softened. The absence of a culprit no longer feels like a gap to be filled. It feels like a fixed feature, an accepted limit. The story has taught its own boundaries. It does not open further. It does not ask to be pushed. It remains complete in its incompleteness. Second Street continues its ordinary passage through time. Days accumulate. Nights return. The house stands without distinction among others. There is no visible marker of difference, no signal of weight. The quiet there does not announce history. It simply holds it, available but inactive, present without pressure. What happened in that house does not echo forward. It remains where it occurred, contained within walls that neither explain nor conceal. The night ended. The silence followed. And in that silence, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to exist as they always have, unchanged, unspoken, and unresolved, held steady by a quiet that has never learned how to move on. The stillness no longer feels like something that follows the story. It feels like the story itself. Everything else has fallen away, leaving behind a condition rather than a narrative. The murders do not unfold in memory. They remain fixed, already complete. There is no sense of approach or departure. Only presence, only containment. The night does not replay itself. It does not sharpen with attention. It does not soften with distance. It exists as a sealed interval, a span of time that closed in on itself and never reopened. What occurred inside that house did not generate momentum. It absorbed it. The energy of the act did not disperse. It settled, heavy and unmoving, into place. The Moore house has carried this weight without alteration. It has not adapted. It has not resisted. The structure did not change to accommodate what happened inside it. The rooms did not become symbolic. The walls did not become expressive. The house remained functional, intact, ordinary. That ordinariness is what keeps the story intact. Nothing signals where meaning should gather. Nothing directs attention. Silence remains evenly distributed. As years continued to pass, the murders stopped behaving like something that could be revisited with expectation. There was no anticipation of discovery, no sense that distance would produce clarity. The case reached a point where inquiry no longer promised movement. Everything essential had already settled. What remained was not potential, but endurance. The absence of resolution did not leave an open wound. It created a closed space, a boundary that could be acknowledged but not crossed. Those who return to the story sense this boundary immediately. There is no progression beyond it. The closer one approaches, the more the story withdraws into its own stillness. It does not resist. It simply does not respond. Villisca has grown accustomed to this non-response. The town does not seek to fill the silence or explain it away. It allows the unresolved to remain unresolved. The murders are not performed as memory. They are carried as knowledge, quietly, without emphasis, without repetition. Second Street continues to exist in the present, unchanged in function. People pass, seasons shift. The house remains among others, unmarked and intact. Nothing in its appearance demands recognition. Only awareness changes the space. Without awareness, the quiet is ordinary. With it, the quiet becomes exact. The Villisca Axe Murders do not progress toward an ending, because they already reached their final form. Action concluded. Meaning did not begin. What followed was not aftermath, but suspension. That suspension has endured, steady and unyielding, held in place by silence that requires no explanation and offers none. The night ended long ago. The stillness did not. The endurance of that stillness has reshaped how the story is carried. It no longer behaves like something that can be advanced or completed. It has settled into a state where presence is enough. The murders are not remembered through detail so much as through atmosphere, through a sense that something exact and contained occurred and left nothing behind that could be followed. The absence of pursuit, the absence of voice, the absence of consequence all align into a single condition that does not loosen with time. The night itself feels less like a point in history and more like a sealed room. It can be described from the outside, measured by what entered and what left, but it cannot be opened again. The boundaries are firm. Inside them, everything happened quickly and without interruption. Outside them, everything slowed and never recovered its pace. The distinction between those two states has never dissolved. It has only grown quieter. The Moore House continues to stand at the center of that distinction. It does not hold memory in the way people do. It holds space. That space has not asked to be interpreted, and it has not offered resistance to interpretation either. It exists as it always has, neither altered nor restored. The rooms do not guide attention. The walls do not frame significance. Nothing indicates where the night pressed hardest. The weight is evenly distributed, making it impossible to isolate. What remains most unsettling is how complete the act was, and how incomplete everything afterward became. The violence did not trail off or falter. It concluded. The explanation never began. This imbalance has defined the case more than any suspect or theory ever did. The murders ended themselves. The story did not. Over time, the absence of resolution ceased to feel temporary. It became permanent enough to feel intentional, even though it was not. The lack of answers hardened into structure. It marked the edge of understanding and held it there. Beyond that edge, nothing waited. No revelation, no correction, only the same silence, intact and undisturbed. Villisca continues alongside this structure, without disruption. The town has not been overtaken by the past, nor has it escaped it. The murders exist in parallel with daily life, not intersecting, not intruding. They are acknowledged without emphasis, carried without display. The house remains part of the town's geography, not separated by ceremony or avoidance, simply present. Night returns as it always has. Darkness settles without variation. Quiet gathers evenly. The Moore House receives it without distinction. Nothing signals that the space holds anything other than itself. Nothing suggests that the stillness should be questioned. What happened there remains contained within that stillness, not moving forward, not fading away, not resolving. It persists as a moment that never opened into explanation, held steady by silence that has proven strong enough to last. The story does not ask for more words. It does not need them. It has reached the place where language naturally falls quiet, where nothing further can be added without breaking the balance it has held for so long. The house on 2nd Street remains where it has always been, its shape unchanged, its rooms intact. It stands through seasons, through years, through lives that pass nearby without interruption. What happened inside it has not spread outward. It has stayed contained, absorbed into the walls, settled into the air, carried forward without movement. No answer arrives to disturb that stillness. No voice steps forward to reshape the night. The murders remain complete in their execution and unfinished in their meaning, suspended in a silence that never demanded explanation and never received it. Villisca continues on. Nights continue to fall. Darkness gathers evenly. The house receives it without reaction, just as it did then. Nothing announces itself. Nothing departs. The quiet holds, and so the story ends where it has always lived, not with resolution, not with revelation, but with presence. A house, a night, a silence that learned how to last.